What is up, hobby friends? In this video, I wanted to show you my quick and easy recipe for painting the Jersey barriers that you see here. And I've painted these for my Marvel Crisis Protocol gaming table. In this video itself, I will be demonstrating on these larger barriers you see in the back, and these are a multi-part STL. It's the base as well as a fence, and this is actually a free STL that you can find on Thingiverse. So I'll make sure that I'll have a link for that in the description below. So if you want to download this for yourself and you have access to a 3D printer, you can easily do that. The ones in front are smaller versions. These are actually sold by Corvus Games Terrain. So they do cost a little bit of money. I bought this as part of the Urban Scatter set, and I like them. It's cool to have the variety between the smaller ones where you can have them sort of in the middle of the road, sort of just as a median, and then some larger ones where you actually want to block off and fence off an area. I have made some modifications to the STL, not really relevant to this tutorial, but I thought I would just walk through it just in case if you're looking at the file and it does seem a little different. So particularly on the smaller ones, there is a nub or a piece that's supposed to be attached on opposite ends so you can connect and link them. But the problem is on these ones, it's purely flat, there's no wiggle room, so if you join them, it's always going to be straight. You can't actually angle them. If you actually look at these larger ones in the back from Thingiverse, the nub is rounded, and rather than be secure, it just sort of slots in, and it gives you a bit of option to curve the barrier as you put the pieces down. Because of the way I also store and transport my terrain, I added in an inset circle or a receiver for a magnet before I printed it, and that way I wouldn't have to do any sort of drilling with a pin vise. It was just sort of print and then ready to go, insert the magnet, and you're off to the races. If you're printing these yourself, one last note, you do need to scale these up. The Corvus Games Terrain set, they do recommend 126% because it is modeled at 28 millimeter, and Marvel Crisis Protocol is a 40 millimeter game. So that's both scale or 1 to 43. So you do want to scale this to 126. I don't remember exactly what percentage these were, but if you have the files in your Cheetah box slicer and you have a 40 millimeter scale figure for reference, you can scale them up accordingly. You typically want these probably about 2.5, 3 feet tall. So a figure at 40 mil is probably going to stand right about there, give or take. So the first part of the Jersey barrier that we want to be painting is the base, and we're going to paint them in 2 different colors. We're going to have half of our batch in white and the other half in orange. And what this will allow us to do is essentially have them grouped and organized to form an alternating color pattern that, if you look at references of Jersey barriers, they're typically found in this sort of 2-tone pattern, and just add that a little bit of extra sort of variety as opposed to having it all uniform. You can paint them like concrete if you want something more of a neutral gray. You can apply sort of the same techniques and approach that we're using. You're just doing it in one single color as opposed to 2. For the white, we're using 3 colors. We're using AK Graphite, Pale Gray, and White, all from AK. We're going to start with a base coat of graphite through the airbrush, and then on top of this, we airbrush another highlight of Pale Gray, and then a final highlight of Pale Gray and White. Predominantly white with just a touch of Pale Gray mixed in. The goal is to essentially have an airbrushed highlight that is just a step down from white. On top of that, we're then doing 2 stippling passes using some tweezers and some stiff pluck foam. We're going to go in with pure Pale Gray, focusing mainly on the underside, but also a little bit on the tops, corners, and edges where we're going to see some wear and tear, and we're going to stipple some darker battle damage. We're then going to take pure white, and we're going to do a heavy stippling pass over the top and working our way down, half highlighting, half also adding some subtle battle damage and wear using the white. And the goal is to essentially create a very textural sort of rough and tumble pattern on the surface. So it's not just a 2 or 3 tone airbrush highlight. The goal is to add texture and nuance to a piece to make it look like it's been hand painted. To paint the orange, we're doing a similar approach, only we're using 2 colors for the airbrush. We're going to base coat with AK Burnt Orange and do a highlight of Vallejo Orange Red. On top of that, again, we're just like with the white, doing a 2-color pass with some tweezers and the pluck foam. We're going to use AK Burnt Red, focusing on the bottom, corners, and some of the edges to create that darker battle damage and chipping. And then for the brighter spots, the edging, and sort of the brighter chunks and chips and things that we're adding in, we're going to do a mix of Vallejo's Orange Red and AK Sunny Skin Tone. Now you can vary up the ratio or the mix of the two. I bounced around between 50-50 and maybe 60-40 Orange Red and Sunny Skin Tone. I didn't want to go super bright with this. I didn't want it to look too cartoony, so I tried to keep it just a step higher than that Orange Red color. And once we've done our acrylic painting on the white and the orange base parts, it's now time to move on to the enamel step. This is pretty much like using oil paints. Very similar, you're going to have to use mineral spirits to dilute and to clean your paintbrush. So you're going to want to have a synthetic brush, much like when you're painting with oils, to paint with this material. You want to be using your nicer Kolinsky sables for this. You will destroy your brushes if you do so. I'm using some Green Stuff World synthetic brushes. This is their green line, and we're using AK's neutral gray enamel wash to do the white barricade, and we're going to be using their panel liner. This is for green and brown armor, but I find that this also works lovely for sort of mid-tone colors, and because it's sort of an earthy tone, it'll work well with our warm orange tone. So with the panel liner for the gray, we can just go straight out of the pot, and we can basically use capillary action to dot and apply this into our recesses and crevices. And then if you want, you can also add a couple of subtle streaks, bit more sort of grime and weathering. So pick some of these darker or brighter spots that you've already chipped onto the surface. Apply a couple of lighter streaks, and you can go in if you want with some mineral spirits and just clean up, fade the edges, pull up the color if you want to, create a bit of a fade, a softer touch to it. And the enamels, much like when you're working with oils, have a very good working time. Even when they're dry, you can go back in with mineral spirits, and you can erase and you can correct and move the color around up until the point when you either seal the piece or several days have passed and the pigment has fully set on the piece. So you actually have a lot of flexibility and workability in this color. So take your time. There's no need to rush through this. Unlike working with acrylics, enamels and oils are very forgiving. I want to show you an example of what I mean in terms of workability. So this is a jersey barrier that I did last night using the exact same colors and techniques. And let's say, for example, there's this streak here that I sort of want to clean up the edge for. Right here on the inside, you can see there's a bit of an overpaint on the edge. I can just go back in with some clean mineral spirits. And you can see just how easy it is to erase and correct. And this enamel was applied about 24 hours ago. So it's been dry for, or left to dry overnight, and it's even now still workable just by reactivating it with the mineral spirits. Do the enamels for the orange in the exact same way. We're just using the panel liner color as opposed to the neutral gray wash. And once again, all we're doing is we're letting capillary action do the work for us. Cleaning up any sort of messy overpaints with some clean mineral spirits as required. When you're applying the sort of streaks and grime with the gray and this panel liner wash, try and think of where these sort of streaks would occur. I'm focusing on these little corners where you're going to have rainwater sort of catching and then pulling. And then where dirt would collect in these corners and that rainwater sort of flows and pulls down with it, I imagine we'll get natural streaks of grime and dirt flowing down. So when you're doing this sort of weathering, try and think of the environment that this material and the stuff is sitting in, and to sort of emphasize that realism, think about how dirt and grime would actually appear and collect on these pieces. Don't just apply it willy-nilly. If you need to, search for reference. There's no shame in finding real-life examples and then using that to inform and dictate the choices that you make. So to paint the fence, we're going to be doing a quick and dirty wet blending dry brushing technique. So I'm going to be using a large dry brush for this. This is from the Artist Opus series. And the colors I'm going to be using are AK's Rubber Black, Ash Gray, Basalt Gray, Graphite, Medium Sea Gray. And then we'll go back in after we've done our dry brushing with these 5 colors with some pale gray to do some stippling and chip weathering. And it'll end up looking something like this. And the reason I've chosen a more of a darker gray tone is because I want the fence to be sort of a dark gray or black metal. I already have a lot of bright terrain elements on my board, and then the orange and the white are also fairly bright. And I wanted something just to contrast and be a little different, and also because I didn't want to paint to a very bright gray. But if you do want a bright gray fence, then maybe you want to start with a brighter tone and work your way up to pale gray, or even almost to like an off-white or an ivory. It's really up to you. We're just covering the technique. So I have this prime black, and it'll be mirrored. It'll be the same on both sides. I'll demonstrate it on one side. We're going to focus our highlighting right here. So I'm going to start with the rubber black, and I'm just going to very quickly, circular motion, start to apply my colors. Jump to my ash gray, and while the paint's still wet, I'm essentially doing basically a wet blend, but I'm keeping my brush strokes nice and light, and so it's almost like a pseudo dry brush the way I'm building up the color. I'll jump to the basalt now. And then the graphite. And you see that as I'm working up the highlight color, I'm focusing more and more on the center spot right here. And the reason I'm choosing to do this by hand and not with the airbrush, I sort of want, at least on the periphery, on the edges, some of those brush strokes and texture to show through. And I also don't want the gray to get too much on the inside, just to have a little bit of shadowing depending on the angle that we end up looking at. I think an airbrush would end up overspraying and honestly just being quite wasteful with the paint. it's fairly easy to do this by hand. To paint the trim, we'll use those same 5 colors. We'll start with the rubber black and the ash gray. Focusing brighter on the top and then sort of a mid-tone on the side. Focusing the highlight on the outer edge. And just similarly working the way up to pure medium sea gray. And then to add a highlight onto this bottom rail, I'll go in with a smaller detail brush, mainly because I don't want to get any sort of dry brush strokes on this dark outer ring. And I'll take like my ash gray and my basalt and work it up to a medium tone, not quite as bright as the top, making sure I get the paint in between each of the different mesh, like its connection points. And once you've got both sides painted and blended and the paint is dry, we're going to use our tweezers and our pluck foam with pale gray. And we're going to do the same sponge chip weathering that we did on the base of the Jersey berries. Keep it nice and light, and we're going to concentrate this in sort of the center cluster, following the way that we have our highlights blended in. As we get further up to the edge, be a little bit more sparing, a little lighter with the application. You don't want to have too heavy or too dense of a pale gray stippling in the shadows, because you'll end up brightening that too much. And we'll do the same thing on the trim. And once all of our fences and bases are painted, we can just assemble it by gluing it together. You don't need to glue the bottom if you're using this STL. The contact points are going to be the bottoms of these nubs, as well as the inside bar. There is a small gap between here and the top. So don't put any super glue here, you're just going to end up with an unsightly mess on top. Put that with super glue. And then just make sure that it all lines up vertically. There's no sway or anything. With the paint and primer on there, it's a fairly snug fit, and the STL has some wiggle room. There is a, they're not super precise. The holes are slightly larger than the pegs themselves. So you have a bit of leeway in terms of getting this to fit very nicely. And that's it. Our Jersey barriers are complete. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. And whether you're painting Jersey barriers for yourself or you're painting some other terrain or even vehicles, hopefully you can take some of these techniques, tips, and tricks and integrate them into your own workflow to allow you to more easily and quickly paint these larger pieces of terrain or gaming pieces without a whole lot of effort or time spent to still get good quality terrain on the table. Make sure you give the video a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.